Well, here we go again. For the last couple of years, French politics has been turbulent, to say the least. A terribly divided parliament with no majority, snap elections, and deeply unpopular leadership. And now, on September the 8th, France could lose its fourth prime minister in 2 years, leading to yet another government collapse. And just to add a bit of extra madness, it's the prime minister himself who has invited parliament to potentially topple his government. In this video, we'll unpack why French Prime Minister François Bayrou has decided to pull the pin and why it might blow up in his face. French politics has been a shambles for quite some time now. Cast your mind back to 2022. President Macron wins re-election, but his victory was hollow. Just a month later, in the legislative elections, his centrist coalition lost over 100 seats and finished way short of a majority. Meanwhile, the left and the far right surged, leaving the National Assembly paralyzed. Prime Minister Elisabeth Borne struggled to govern. She was forced to rely on Article 49.3, a constitutional mechanism that allows the government to ram through budgets without a vote in Parliament. That's the only reason that Macron was able to pass his deeply controversial pension reforms, leaving the Assembly and the country incensed. After months of compromises and backroom deals, even cutting deals with the far right, Borne was forced to resign in January 2024. Macron's party was then further weakened by a humiliating performance in the European Parliament elections, and in a desperate gamble, he dissolved the National Assembly and called new legislative elections. That gamble backfired spectacularly. The July 2024 snap poll resulted in an even more fragmented parliament, with Macron's bloc losing its position as the largest parliamentary grouping. The right briefly took power after Macron appointed Republican Prime Minister Michel Barnier with support from the far right, but his government collapsed after just 3 months after he lost a confidence vote. And so François Bayrou entered the stage, a close ally of Macron and his fourth prime minister in barely 2 years. Bayrou promised to steady the ship, but he was faced with a parliament in ruins and an electorate whose patience was wearing thin. He found himself trapped in the same deadlock as his predecessors. And nowhere was that clearer than with the budget, the 2026 spending plan that has brought Bayrou's government to the brink of collapse. The 2026 budget was supposed to be Bayrou's opportunity to prove that he could succeed where his predecessors had failed, reassuring markets, restoring credibility, and proving that France was still governable. In reality, it turned into a lightning rod for outrage. At the heart of his plan were some deeply controversial policies. 2 of France's public holidays, long seen as part of the national rhythm, were to be scrapped. He wanted to save 44 billion euros through a combination of cuts right across ministries, pension squeezes, welfare freezes, and tax rises. In practice, it meant a harsher squeeze on ordinary households who were already struggling so much with the cost of living and stagnant wages. The opposition seized on it instantly. The left denounced it as harsh austerity, accusing the government and Bayrou of making workers and ordinary families pay the price of deficits while sparing the wealthy. The far right claimed to be the great defenders of purchasing power while folding in their predictable arguments about immigration. Even the mainstream right, once a potential ally of the government, refused to come to Bayrou's rescue. Meanwhile, outside Parliament, pressure was building fast. The unions had already called for a nationwide strike to take place on September 10th, aimed squarely at the public spending cuts and the loss of public holidays. The prospect of millions of French citizens marching through the streets evoked fears of what happened back in 2022 with the pension reforms. Once again, a parliament in deadlock and a country at the end of its tether. Faced with paralysis, Bayrou decided to gamble everything. Rather than let the assembly tear his bill apart piece by piece, he turned the fight into a test of his own survival. He announced a confidence vote for September the 8th, a simple yes or no. Either Parliament backs him or he resigns. In doing so, Bayrou pulled the pin himself. What should have been a routine budget debate has turned into the ultimate showdown, with the fate of the government and possibly the stability of the Fifth Republic itself hanging in the balance. On the surface, Bayrou's gamble might even look bold, an attempt to galvanize his supporters and maybe win back a few drifters, but the parliamentary arithmetic just isn't on his side. Let's crunch the numbers. There are 577 seats in the National Assembly, which means Bayrou needs 289 votes in his favor to survive as Prime Minister. So, let's start with the centrists. His own bloc in the center gives him about 161 votes. And you know what? Let's be generous and let's add in the Republicans as well. And that takes him all the way up to 210. Well on the way to hitting the target of 289. But before Bayrou can get too excited, let's have a look at the opposition parties who've declared that they will vote to kick him out. First of all, the far-right National Rally, that's 123 votes against him. Then we have the far-left France Unbowed, 71 votes. Then we can add on the Greens, 28, and the Communists with 8. That brings us up to 230 votes against the Prime Minister. Then there are the other right-wing deputies, around 15, so that brings us up to 245 votes to kick out the Prime Minister. And finally, we have the Socialist Party with 65 seats. Now, there was some speculation that the Socialists might be able to cut some kind of deal with Bayrou to lend him their votes, maybe if he dropped the plans to scrap 2 public holidays, but their leader has said that it would be inconceivable for his party to vote for François Bayrou. So if we add on his 65, that takes us up to 310, way past the threshold of 289 to kick the Prime Minister out. Now, of course, there might be a handful of sympathetic dissenters who decide to support the Prime Minister, but even if every single centrist and every single Republican votes to save Bayrou, which, by the way, is far from guaranteed, he would still need to find another 79 votes from the opposition. And there is just no pathway to allow that to happen. In other words, François Bayrou is toast. Failure would trigger another political earthquake. If the Prime Minister loses the confidence vote, he and his government must resign immediately. To be clear, President Macron's position is safe regardless, but Macron will then have to appoint yet another Prime Minister. After 4 heads of government in 2 years, his options are narrowing fast. Now, he could try to appoint another centrist ally, but without the backing of Parliament, he'll run into exactly the same obstacles that Bayrou did. Alternatively, the left-wing New Popular Front have the most seats in Parliament, so there's an argument that Macron should appoint someone from their camp. But again, they are unlikely to secure the cross-party support needed to be able to govern. The other option up Macron's sleeve could be to dissolve the National Assembly and call snap legislative elections. The president has the power to call new elections once per year, and since the last set of elections were just over a year ago, that is technically something he could do. But it's the nuclear option, very high risk, and it spectacularly backfired on him back in 2024. On one hand, polls suggest that actually the majority of French voters do want fresh elections. On the other hand, when asked actually how they would vote, the polling suggests that new elections would produce a very similar result to what we have at the moment, a fractured parliament with no overall majority. At the time of recording, Macron has said he will not dissolve parliament if the government is defeated and insists that regardless of what happens, he is going nowhere. But his decision to call the snap elections last year was erratic, almost spontaneous, so who really knows? The consequences of this go far beyond just political theatre. Another government collapse during the budget process risks delaying France's financial plans, alarming markets and further undermining confidence in the French economy. Already, borrowing costs have risen and the unions are preparing for a mass walkout. Add a leadership election on top, and the sense of drift only deepens. For ordinary citizens, it means more instability. At a time when wages are stagnant, prices are rising, public services are under pressure, and faith in politics is collapsing. For the EU, it means its second largest power paralyzed again, unable to lead on issues from the war in Ukraine to addressing the climate crisis. And for the wider democratic world, the symbolism matters too. France has long prided itself on being a model of republican resilience, but the spectacle of repeated government collapses at a time when the far right is on the rise across the West sends precisely the opposite message. Each failed prime minister chips away at faith in the system itself and lends strength to the argument of those who say that democracy cannot deliver. So yes, Bayrou's gamble might look like one man daring Parliament to make a choice, but in reality, it is France itself on the edge of collapse yet again. At each time the government falls, the stakes grow larger, for the French people, for Europe, and for democracy itself. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to press the like button. It really does help get the video out there to more people. And if you're new around here, my name is Connor, and I make deep dives into politics, both here in France and around the world. So if that sounds interesting, why not hover over that subscribe button, give it a click. Thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.